All right, let's kick things off by looking into the weekly roundup, what's been happening around the world. Tanzania is facing sharp international criticism as SADC and the EU and multiple rights organizations describe the country's recent elections as, neither free, fair, or credible. Reports highlight widespread voter intimidation, ballot manipulation, internet throttling, and there's so much that's been blocked. Human rights observers warn that over 3,000 people may have been killed or disappeared in post-election violence, a figure denied by the government that now focus calls for an international investigation.
There's always going to be deny. There's an interesting headline that came out that said that this was a coronation. It was not a contest. So I'm looking at writing something about all hail the Queen, long live the Queen, from that perspective. Because, but it took a lot of time for those people to for international community to turn around and say, by the way, what you've done is a very bad thing.
Indeed.
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Warren Njoroge.
I'm Nduako.
Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time. With nuance, with history, and with a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here.
It's interesting that the scathing, damning reports are coming from many organizations now. Whether we're looking at from the EU, looking at from SADC, East Africa Community wasn't so damning, but everybody seems to be nodding in unison in terms of what's happened in Tanzania after this election.
But the thing that's interesting has come out is the fact that there was protests as well. I mean, they've said about 3,000 people could have been killed. Mm-hmm. The thing is it a trend we're seeing from Nepal? Kenya's done the same thing. I'm waiting. Uganda's next having their elections, aren't they?
Next month.
So there's going to be a domino effect.
It would appear so.
Unless he nips it in the bud right now. And there's a story about him coming up a bit later that we need to talk about.
There is.
Yeah. So now, this is an interesting one. A new economic review shows that United States has now surpassed China as Africa's leading investor, channeling more major capital into technology, which is standard, renewable energy, which is standard, finance, and media, actually. Hooray, media. As part of a renewed push to strengthen economic partnerships and secure deeper influence in the continent's fast-growing, future-defining sectors.
Well, was there a race for somebody to have passed the other in the first place, or was just the influence that's being felt?
I think the influence has been felt more than anything else. Yeah. But in terms of, I'm a geek with the computers and stuff. Technology-wise, I'm not seeing how they're going to take on the East the way these guys are coming out. Their robotics, their AI systems, and everything like that. Financial, I can understand. But yeah, it's. The fact that they've overtaken them, I guess, is a good thing.
It's a big deal in one way, whether you want to look at it or not. But the question isn't who's looking where and who's going to gobble it up.
Okay.
You can produce and move at lightning speed, but who's taking it? Who's using it? Who's experiencing it? That's where you feel the impact.
Yeah. Okay, when I say it's a good thing, it's good for the Americans, not necessarily so for the Chinese.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
All right. So the G20 summit comes to South Africa, and we've seen that as a result of, not because it comes to South Africa, but the US pulls out of the G20 summit. South Africa is hosting the G20 summit, and it's the first ever held on African soil. Diplomatic circles were caught off guard when the United States withdrew just hours before, offering no immediate explanation. Analysts are watching closely for signs of policy shifts or internal political motives behind the decision.
What is it actually saying about? Because I know, one of the headlines was, at least here in Kenya, was J.D. Vance no longer coming here.
Sure, of course. But this is also happening at the same time where COP30 is taking place. The US, Russia, India not attending COP20. Those are statements that are being made.
Well, America doesn't believe there's global warming.
Under Trump.
Not America. Trump doesn't believe there's global
warming. That climate it's not an issue, really. Let's,
But he was recently joined by, what's his name? This billionaire Bill Gates.
There you go.
That's the one.
It took a minute, but okay.
Yeah. So you can tell what kind of day I'm having. Bill Gates, I think it was Bill Gates who said, this aspect of global warming is not really, it's been pushed too far. It's not as much as a crisis as people are making it out to be.
This is true. These are statements that are being made, though. You pull out of a big global
absolutely.
event like the G20. It's not just because you remember that you were busy.
I left the lights on. I left the oven on at home.
Excuse me while I, take the turkey out of the oven. Not really. There's a statement that's being made here, and policy makers, shapers are watching to say, okay, so what does this mean exactly? It'll all coincide with the discussions that are had at the G20. Then you'll be able to see why the US then decided to pull out of it. You'll see it very soon shaping up.
Okay. Back to Africa, and we had mentioned this before. So President Yoweri Museveni stirred debate, after saying it is unfair. Uganda has no ocean. Third world problems. Jokingly, right, he said that he would be ready to go to war if that's what it takes to get coastal access. The remarks basically have sparked regional humor and revived conversations about East Africa's trade corridors. There was Migingo Island at one point, wasn't there?
Of course there is.
Yeah.
Mfangano Island also, another one. There was people having issues around this. It was interesting because Museveni has said that, don't joke with us because this will be a war. We can't all be living in the same compound. I mean, the folks who live on the ground floor don't have access to the compound, essentially. Or those who live on the top floor don't have access to the compound. So that's what we're looking at here. But it'll be interesting that the stuff of war, conflict, is around resources. And here's another big resource, sure,
Exactly.
but, Uganda's landlocked sounds like a geography issue as opposed to a diplomatic one.
Absolutely.
But okay.
Well, that's your roundup for today.
Across the Horn of Africa, a new contest is shaping the region's future of wars without victory, alliances without trust, and a peace industry that too often profits from chaos. Sudan bleeds while diplomacy drifts. Somalia regroups under the shadow of Al-Shabaab. Ethiopia rearms as it searches for sea access. And Eritrea waits, silent but never still. The result is a corridor where humanitarian crises meets great power ambition. A region courted, coerced, and contested all at once.
So what we are actually asking is what keeps the Horn of Africa so unstable? Is it weak institutions that can't hold the line, foreign hands that won't let go, or the politics of profit built into war itself? Why do peace agreements expire faster than the ink that actually seals them?
To help us unpack that, we're joined by Dr. Hassan Khannaje, Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, a leading voice on peace building, counterterrorism, and regional security, and one of the few analysts unafraid to ask whether the Horn's greatest export has become its own instability.
Because before we talk about peace, we have to understand the business of chaos. Who fuels it? Who funds it, and why it keeps paying dividends.
So, Professor Khannaje, thank you so much for joining us to go into some of these issues. Really glad to see you.
Great to see you too.
And as we talk about this, let's look into the business of disorder, starting that 9 million. That's the number that we're given from UN OCHA about the number of Sudanese who are displaced inside their own borders. Now, according to the UN OCHA, it's also the largest internal displaced crisis anywhere in the world. We're not just talking about the African continent, in the world. One that you would think would take and, pick up attention from different countries. So the question is, you've called the Horn a conflict economy. Why does disorder remain so profitable in the Horn and then also looking into Sudan?
Because there are those who always profit from chaos. Order is not always good for everybody. When it comes to conflict profiteers, they can only grow and thrive in the environment of conflict. And the more it persists, the more it escalates, the more they profit. Of course, until the law of diminishing marginal returns, sets in. And that is when you find some of those parties perhaps, supporting efforts at either de-escalation or trying to resolve some of those conflicts. If the calculation is that an eventual resolution to them is going to be more profitable than the status quo.
Okay, but is the driver the aspect of weak institutions, that can't actually enforce the peace, or outside patrons? And that's a very critical thing. Are there outside patrons who benefit from the management of a stalemate?
One thing that is important for us to understand is most of the conflicts within the continent have revolved around resources.
Okay.
Even the politics that we see still revolve around the resources. And most of those resources tend to be consumed by external partners. The weapons and arms that are used, are supplied by, of course, external actors. And so they have an interest both in perpetuation of the status quo, but in certain circumstances, sometimes they have an interest in the end of the status quo if it's going to profit them.
Yeah.
And we have seen it even increasingly in recent years, some state actors intervening in certain conflicts if it's going to profit them, or at least if a settlement is going to be more profitable to them. Okay. So yes, it's both.
Okay, and so leaning into that just a little bit, we take a look at Sudan, and that not just the conflict that is on, but what had happened before, looking into Darfur, and there were thoughts and that there were external parties directly involved. The business of conflict is not cheap. And would this contribute to an ongoing conflict?
You see, local parties with the limited capacities they always have, they can only persecute a conflict so long. Without constant supply lines of both money as well as arms, it is impossible for conflict to be sustained for a long time. If we have to take an example, for instance, of the conflict in Tigray, the fundamental change or shift came from the fact that the TPLF was no longer able to resupply. And because of that, factors conspired against them to ensure they actually literally capitulated, to the government and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. And so that led to a lot faster conclusion of the conflict than it would have been, for instance, if both parties were being supported and armed from outside, both in terms of finances as well as arms.
So pull the plug, end the conflict.
Basically, yeah. So if I was to look at the anatomy of crisis, of chaos as a whole, we're looking from places like Jeddah to Addis, and I think we've touched on this. But we've had situations where the peace talks have basically stalled while the war economy deepens, right? So Chatham House notes that control of Sudan's gold fields now actually fuels the conflicts. So the question would be, what keeps every initiative failing? Is it, again, poor design? Is it lack of leverage? Or actually deliberate spoilers who are meddling in there, which is tied to the resource flows? Yeah.
For an armed conflict, especially in an intrastate conflict, to end, when you're having, let's say, identifiable strong factions, you need both the carrots to sweeten any peace arrangement, to the sticks to ensure that those parties who are going to go outside that arrangement, they're going to be punished. Now, that has been missing in both. And that is why some of these conflicts have remained intractable. It is not because there is absence of capacity by the international community to solve them. There is just absence of interest to actually realize that.
Okay. So if there was an ingredient that you would add, and if the interest was there, because we have seen, vehement interest in other conflicts where parties then would get involved. So if you would redesign one mechanism tomorrow, would you centralize ceasefire enforcement? Would you sanction gold routes or change the guarantors?
Now, that is, depends case by case basis. Even in the case of Sudan, first of all, I will harmonize the efforts that are meant to, lead to a settlement. Because right now you're having competing efforts, coming from multiple quarters, whether it's from the IGAD region, from African Union, from the Jeddah, talks, Geneva talks and stuff like that. And that has literally conspired to ensure no solution is actually reached. Why? Because there are so many actors that are being left outside in those processes that are in the absence of harmonization. It does not matter what you do. Remember, the key actors themselves that are funneling the conflict, they have an interest, in perpetuating the conflict until they can get a favorable outcome to them. And so if you don't harmonize in a way in which is going to force both the region as well as the international community, especially critical actors from the Gulf and the West, to play their part and hold each other accountable, It doesn't matter what mechanism you're going to have, it's going to fail.
Okay, I want to switch gears and look at the aspect of religion, race and reality, and identity, actually. So, in the Horn, religion and ethnicity often masks economics, right? We have land, we have trade, we have taxation, dressed up basically as what we call belief. I'm going to come back again to Sudan as an example. In Sudan and across the region, actually, if I move bigger and out, right? Is identity the fuel or just the match that lights the fire?
Identity and ideology becomes organizing principle. It's always about politics and economics. Someone once said, "Is the economy stupid?" So it's always about the stomach.
Okay.
Now, what we have seen increasingly is religionization of politics and politicization of religion, mostly for economic and political ends, either way.
Okay.
And when you look at both the genesis of many of these conflicts, as well as perpetuation, and even the eventual conclusion, has an aspect to do ultimately with elite pacting based on dispersion of power and economics aspect, or the economic aspects of the state. Because even that power, because of the nature of African societies or governments, they are connected to resources and their extraction. And so you can't remove resources from it. These communities have been diverse for many years.
Yes.
Even on the continent. They were not always killing each other, fighting each other. Then what changed? Because colonialism introduced, of course, capitalism. And capitalism produced a very selfish kind of monopoly ownership of things and controlling resources, which required you, or rather which enable you to control the state or the state apparatus. And so access to those resources became very important, and so politics became organized around that. Now, religion and identity are convenient organizing vehicles, because the moment you appeal to faith or creed or people's identity, which they cannot change easily, for instance, it becomes something very emotional. And human beings rarely respond to reason. In most cases, they respond to emotion, how you make them feel. And identity and religion makes them feel.
Okay.
Other things that makes them think don't have that much impact.
So are there examples when it's very clear that there's a material struggle, but it's been masked by this religion or identity which makes people feel, as opposed to brick and mortar with the, in this case, the dollars on the ground? Do we have examples of that?
Oh, many.
Okay.
For instance, within the Horn of Africa, part of the reason why the Islamic Courts Union and then later on Al-Shabaab became extremely powerful, is because they politicized religion and then religionized politics. And so what happened is they framed everything in us versus them, because in a bid to get rid of the clanist and ethnic identities, you had to bring an alternative to that. And what was it? Religion.
Okay.
In Sudan, for the longest time, the conflict was never about religion. It was always about politics and access to economic resources. And so you can see in the intervening years, between 55 and 1989, the introduction of Islamism that, of course, someone like al-Bashir also profited from, especially in his opposition or in his fight against the South. But the moment that facade fell off in 2011, then what happened? There was now a new, of course, attack that was already unfolding in Darfur region. And yet, Darfurians, by and large, 99% of them are Muslims. So was it actually about religion? Now, increasingly, you are seeing today, as we speak, Islamists now belong to both camps. Both they belong to RSF and also belong to SAF, even though RSF is, accuses government of being Islamist. At the same time, you're having factions of Islamist parties on both ends. But both of them are trying to instrumentalize in a way that can actually benefit them. And so most of African conflicts have less been about religion, have been more about power and politics as well as economics.
All right, let's look a little bit about into foreign powers and proxy control. Obviously, the puppet and the master ideal imagery comes to mind here. And so when we look at global trade, 14% of it moves to the Red Sea. During the 2024 attacks, the Suez traffic fell by nearly half. Gulf monarchies, great power navies, and regional rivals they're all now competing for control. We can see that. Who's calling the shots in the Horn today? Who essentially is the puppet master, where Gulf money, great powers, or neighbours with unfinished business? Who is involved in this conflict?
I wish today we could have a puppet master, because when you have a puppet master, you know actually where to go to who's controlling the puppet. There's a phenomenon that has emerged in the better part of the last 10 to 15 years, is what I call the relative decline of the West as a result of the rise of the rest. And the rise of the rest has created a new world disorder, not a new world order. Now, this new world disorder is affecting us now. The Horn of Africa region has become a new theater for global geopolitics, characterized by new world disorder. And that is why you're having a multiplicity of actors, both emerging as well as great powers within the region, whether are from the Gulf or from Europe or from Asia. There is no country or no region in the global south that actually has as many concentrations of military assets for power projection as the Horn of Africa is today, in a very small area. Just Djibouti alone has a number of military, bases by the big powers. And the reason is because of the critical nature of the Horn of Africa and what it means to the coming world order. As Africa's agency rises within the international economic and diplomatic, order, so, of course, is the interest of both the emerging as well as the great powers, realizing that, for instance, for the Gulf countries, that hydrocarbons is a finite resource, and that the old alliances perhaps are no longer tenable, and that perhaps the only way you can guarantee survival is for you to expand southward, especially if you can no longer expand northward, considering the kind of challenges and ultranationalism that we have seen in the West today.
Okay. Earlier you'd mentioned just before you'd mentioned the aspect of RSF, and there are UN reports that link external arms to Sudan's RSF. When ports and budgets and security forces depend on foreign funding, do African states actually still have any leverage at all, or is it just an illusion?
Unfortunately, we live in a world where there's a willing buyer and a willing seller. And states get into this making their conscious calculations on what they're going to get out of it. And so we cannot actually sit back and say Africans do not have agency. The countries that do not have agency, they've decided not to have agency either because of absence of clear understanding of what is at stake, or two, just lack of organization. And as they say, you either organize or you're going to remain agonizing. And so what we see is the countries within the region are agonizing in part because of lack of organization. Because if there is a common agency that can be built, it's going to give you a bigger bargaining chip. My institution did a study commissioned by IGAD on a policy-oriented study was supposed to inform IGAD's common position and plan of action. Now, if that is approached that way, then of course you're going to increase your agency. In the absence of that, when you have everybody coming for you, it reminds me of a study we also published called Flirting with Hyenas, how external interests are fueling instability in the Horn of Africa. Now, the Horn has become like this little goat, and now you have hyenas, coming for it. And so the question is not whether we have agency, are we prepared to build agency that's going to be needed to deal with the new and emerging challenges that has been created by the new world disorder as a result of the rise of the rest.
Speaking about being organized and organizations, I want to look at the failure of peace. We've got the AU and we've got IGAD, and usually they're the first on the scene, but the last to be heard. Reactive more than strategic, if that would be fair to say, basically. Has the AU actually lost the moral and operational authority to lead anything regarded to peace in the Horn?
Good question. I think that question is coming from an assumption that they had the moral to start with.
Okay.
You see, we have this common refrain that a lot of us have been proud about as Africans, that African solutions to African problems. And I always add, you can't have African solutions to African problems without African money. Without money, you cannot build agency. The African Union has a budget of about $600 million.
Yep.
You get about $200 million. Most of it is funded by who? by foreigners. How can you control your agenda if you cannot actually control how it's funded? That becomes a problem. Number two, an institution is only as good as the sum total of those who represent it.
Okay.
Today, as we speak, we have a new chair of the African Union Commission, who's been very quick, of course, to congratulate 92-year-old man who's been elected in Cameroon. Yep. When clearly, of course, those elections were questionable. Even in our neighbour, to the extent that, the government of our neighbouring country, of Kenya, that's of Tanzania, excluded virtually all the opposition, players. Of course, it raises questions with regard to legitimacy of that, and those are things that should be discussed at African Union level. So before you move to even congratulate, because the moment you congratulate, you are giving legitimacy.
Yes, sure.
Yes,
yeah.
And so we are not, of course, surprised that the African Union is unable to undertake certain things. Why? Not only don't they have the money to do it, they're also increasingly lacking, the moral judgment and high ground to be able to appeal to people in a way that people can actually follow. However, it's still the only institutions that we actually have, and therefore we, as a continent, there is need to strengthen them by also holding them a lot more accountable, but ensuring that they're also self-sufficient. You cannot tell me that the African Union $600 million budget cannot be raised by Africans. Kenya's budget is about $3 billion. African Union budget is $600 million. You really tell me that we cannot be able to raise that money? And so, because of absence of serious engagement, both in REX as well as the continental body, that is what has actually killed it. But also, as I mentioned, the fact that it reflects the sum total of its parts. How do its parts look like today?
Okay. So even when you ask for the attention from different parts of the world, where you've already established that only comes with interest, and if you were to say, all right, first, if Africa does have the resources, it does, from this, you're looking at a $600 million bill per year, right? What kind of money are we saying that Africa would need to run something like this, a fund to run what the African Union does, for example, without Western money? Possible?
It's absolutely possible. Look, at the UN budget is actually pretty modest, and they've been doing a lot of things, And so, comparably, if Africa is able to master anything between $1.5 to $2 billion, it can actually be able to undertake a lot of missions successfully. And because of the principle of subsidiarity, it can always outsource to REX, which institutions to be able to do other things. But this is not something that has been exercised sufficiently, because there hasn't been that expectation from the African Union to raise its own standards with regard to accountability.
By others. Or the demand by other countries or individuals, community groups, to demand of the African Union to do it for itself.
I think one of the things is going to be needed is actually African citizens to demand, because even the RECs, they tend to be more state-centric. And so it's the leadership that is going to determine what's going to happen. Today, even within the East African community setting, for instance, you have free riders who do not actually pay dues. They're taking matatus for free.
All right. So let's look at the humanitarian part of it, because that's what you got a lot of groups shouting about at the moment, isn't it? So by the mid-2025, over 4 million people had fled Sudan across borders, according to UN figures cited by Reuters. We're looking at a couple of weeks where 300,000 from Sudan making their way into countries like Kenya and into Ethiopia. So why is the global response so muted when you compare to crises anywhere? Is it fatigue, geopolitics, or who the victims are?
One thing that is important, I think, for our listeners to understand, Sudan is, I think, the third largest country in Africa, about the 8th most populous country. It is a significant, neighboring, I think, 7 other countries, something like that. And so what happens in Sudan has an impact on many, many countries, in Africa. Now, the question with regard to why is something not happening right now, it is important to understand what we meant by a New World Disorder. A New World Disorder has changed with regard to leadership when it comes to global governance, as well as global responses to crisis. Africa is no longer are the epicenter of priorities when it comes to leading countries on the globe.
Okay.
Whether it's from Brussels, Washington, or London, it's being viewed as an afterthought. One, the first focus, for instance, in the global West is on the transatlantic relations, especially between the United States and Europe, especially with regard to what is happening in Europe, the conflict in Ukraine, between Russia, of course, and Ukraine. That has actually been number one. And they just happen to pick occasion, and let's be honest, as they say, white is right. And while it is easy to say we are in a post-racial kind of world, global apartheid is actually alive and well. And so what is happening on the continent is always going to be an afterthought. Secondly, there is increased fatigue among some donor countries and partners when it comes to African problems and African conflicts. And part of it is driven by the increasing nationalism within those countries. In fact, I would call it nativist nationalism, a more inward-looking kind of politics that's preventing those countries from extending the kind of these liberal ideas in trying to all of us are in it together, kind of mentality. And thirdly, has to do with just the scale of complexities within the continent. Within the Horn region alone, you're having that yet to be completed conflict in Ethiopia. You have really, really very shaky peace in South Sudan. There is a likelihood of implosion in Somalia, especially in the next election, because there's an absence of understanding between the center and the periphery on even how to conduct that election. And of course, in Sudan, kind of the worst, humanitarian crisis. In DRC, largest country within the East African community, for instance, with a lot of resources, but lots of complexities there. And so you have this increasing fatigue with continued investment in a place that, people are not really seeing results at a time when those economies, for instance, are also facing, a downturn. According to World Bank's own projections, EU economy combined is going to grow at a maximum of around 1.3%. That's not even sufficient. And so increasingly they're focusing, of course, on defense and other aspects and other social aspects. And so there's a combination of fatigue, but it's also just, the realization that, Africa is no longer as important in calculations of some of those people, even though in reality, Africa should actually be important because it has one of the fastest growing economies as a region in the world.
And resources.
Youth population and resources. But of course, when you get into nativist kind of politics, they don't exactly see that because, let's be honest, how many people in Brussels, an average person, understands anything about Africa?
Well,
how many Africans understand about Africa? Sorry, that's a very loaded question. So if I was to give you a hypothetical, I want to bring us into this conversation now in terms of us as Kenya. If Kenya and its neighbors actually chose a specific role, should it be the aspect of humanitarianism, moderators, hosts, or become the region's conscience, as it were, right? And this is just, again, hypothetical. What single action could shift outcomes within 90 days? Let's look at 90 days and say, how do we shift outcomes depending on what role we play? Kenya and its neighbors, sorry.
No single country within the region has the capacity to be able to change the course and the direction of what is happening. Is going to require, for instance, key countries such as Kenya to lead a diplomatic initiative that can actually bring together a meeting of minds over certain aspects, especially, for instance, in Sudan, of humanitarian, intervention in ways in which not that there's going to be a deployment of a military force, but certain corridors are going to be opened by both parties to ensure that these people have access, and they can also be able to leave the country. That is something that is doable. Why? Because regional countries actually have influence over the parties in Sudan. Why? Whether it's the RSF or SAF, they have regional alliances. They use regional countries to be able to conduct activities. To that extent, of course, they do. And so only collectively can they actually be able to do that. But in isolation, it's going to be impossible for one single country to do that, in part because there is increased polarization inside Sudan and a lot of distrust of regional countries by competing parties.
Okay. So we're looking at the way forward. Somalia's economy is small but digital. The National Bureau of Statistics actually indicates 2024 GDP at about $12 billion. Yet donors still cover 2/3 of its budget. If you were to design a new African peace architecture, where exactly would you start? As in, where would you put the first piece? Would you be looking at leadership? Would you be looking at enforcement? Would you be looking at a ring-fenced fund?
One, we look at reforming the institutions we currently have.
Okay.
First of all, to make sure they're actually viable. Because resources without discipline, is not really going to bring much. And so, whether it's within the African Union, peace and security, architecture, or within the regional recs, they need to be reformed. Two, they need to be resourced. What we've done is we've created ideas without money. And without money, of course, going to be extremely difficult. And one of the things that a lot of us have always advocated for is every rec need to be able to set up a peace fund. And that peace fund, they need to be paid by their own taxpayers. It has to become part of national laws. And so, you are paying 50 cents or 1 shilling or 1 franc or whatever it is that's going to go toward a peace fund. That the regional bodies are actually going to be able to use in ensuring this peace, either in your own country or even neighboring countries, or take missions such as what the East African force was doing in DRC, for instance, because even the standby force that we have in East Africa, for instance, is not working very well. The ECOMOG, doesn't have enough resources to make those interventions, and so first, institutionalize, reform those institutions to make them stronger, to harmonize decision making in a way that is you make it actually more efficient, so you can remove lots of political squabbling, and then have the resource always going to be on the ready to be able to be deployed.
Okay. So if you were looking at reforms, what single reform would let the AU or IGAD act before, a crisis metastasizes or after it explodes? What are we looking for? What would we be looking at?
One, we need to move slowly towards depoliticizing the institutions, especially the governance of the institutions. And I'm saying this because you do remember that a couple of years ago, when Kenya was seeking the leadership of IGAD, because of the political differences with Addis Ababa also fronted someone for the same. And then Nairobi decided they were no longer going to proceed that. And then Addis Ababa also said the same thing. And so the seat ended up with Sudan. Now, it's ending up with Sudan at a time when there's actually conflict in Sudan. And Sudan ended up chairing IGAD at its worst moments. And so IGAD could not actually do anything because the person who's supposed to be calling up other people to order, guess what? He or she is the one in conflict. And so because of these rigid rules that could not allow for smooth transition or move to another chair and something like that, it became paralyzed by that. And so to remove paralysis, first of all, you need to create efficiencies within these institutions to ensure there is succession, there is transition, and that the member state politics alone or their feelings are not going to actually affect the actual decisions of the organ.
I want to stick with Somalia, if that's okay.
Go.
Yeah. So statistically, over 70% of Somalis actually use mobile money mobile money almost every day. Nearly 40% of GDP by World Bank estimates. Yeah. 2/3 of the 2025 federal budget still depends on donors. I think we touched on that before. At what point does partnership become control?
There is forced control and there is willful control. What we have in Somalia is willful control. You see, when a country with almost 20 million people has a budget of $1 billion, there's a problem.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. If you're raising 10 billion, it's harder to be controlled. If it's 1 billion, that someone can write one check for that and they're going to control everything. Now, that is not to say they're being controlled, but then one of the things has been missing in the Somali economy is a fiscal policy and understanding and competence to actually be able to raise money. The Somali economy generates way more than $1 billion in a month. Okay, much less have a budget of $1 billion, most of which is funded by foreigners.
Yeah.
How can you possibly have a budget of $1 billion when a neighboring country like Kenya has a budget of $3 billion? When geographically you're actually bigger.
Yeah.
You understand? You see? And they have a lot of resources.
Yes.
Somalia is not exactly a poor country.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it, and so what a lot of us have argued when it comes to technical support, is Somalia needs to be assisted in trying to streamline its tax system so that Al-Shabaab should not be collecting half as much money as the national government. Okay.
Yeah.
And that federal member states, whatever is being collected, somehow it's harmonized in ways in which it contributes to the national good. And that the nation also lived up, or the central or the federal government in Mogadishu also lived up to its commitments in line with the constitution to share resources with federal member states. Because if you do that, you're likely to increase Somalia's national budget from $1 billion to even $5, 6, 7, $8 billion.
Okay.
If you do that, it's going to be less dependency on external actors. But as I mentioned, since they're not organized and disciplined to ensure that happens, they keep agonizing for the better part of the last 30 years.
Okay.
So there's a part where they're not organized, because we've talked about disorganization. We've also talked about the elements of foreign control. Is it possible for these two parties to do a dance whereby then everybody can benefit, from this? What is it actually going to take in terms of reform for Mogadishu to be able to find its own security, act without these controls, without waiting essentially for permission?
What Mogadishu needs to do is to be left to grow.
Left alone?
Yeah, they need to be left alone at some point to grow. That does not mean the region should abandon them.
Yeah.
But there are certain aspects of engagement that should be left to Mogadishu. Because the idea of tutelage and treating Mogadishu as if they're children, it's not something that's actually going to be very helpful.
Okay.
They need to be left to test the world and figure out a way in which, for instance, they can reconcile. They can be assisted to reconcile. They cannot be forced to reconcile, because any time a solution is seen to be coming from outside,
there's going to be pushback.
Somalia is always going to push back.
Yeah.
And three groups of people or nations in the world that have been known, even anthropologically, to be extremely difficult to accept foreign solutions are Afghans and Somalis.
Okay. So you can't leave them to... When you said leave them to grow, I thought you meant left to their own resources. But you've quantified the fact that they do need some assistance, but they need to be allowed to grow. So as we bring the show to a close, or this episode to a close, I want to get some quick reflections on your part. From a personal perspective, what has the region taught you about the nature of power?
The nature of power, depends if it's national or is it, regional.
Okay.
If it's national, I think the region is here to understand the functions of power in a way in which you can deploy power for common good.
Okay.
And because of a system that was inherited at the colonial era, we really like to be able to consolidate and pretty much control everything. And we think power means being able to do things unilaterally, without, consultation. Unfortunately, we don't come from, fiefdoms or miniature ethnic kingdoms where you can be able to do that.
Okay.
And since most of the countries in the region signed up to the democratic project, you realize you're going to have to negotiate with other nations within one nationality to be able to move. Second, from an interstate perspective, there's been a lot of resistance when it comes to ceding a degree of sovereignty for common good. And that has militated against efforts at integration, as well as common efforts to be able to bring about peace and do economics. Look, one of the oldest and perhaps more successful integration projects within the world is actually the East African community. But look at how many hurdles the region still faces as a result of that. And so we don't understand that actually power is better exercised and achieved by working collaboratively and strategically together. And in so doing, is not going to be the example of your power that the world is going to respect and deal with. Is going to be the power of your example that's going to attract others towards you.
Like that. So looking at the aspect of hope and unease, Hope and unease. Name one of each for the Horn of Africa in 2026.
One, I think to the extent that things, while they're still, flaring up in Ethiopia, things have calmed progressively. It's something good, even though we know that most of the peace is enjoyed around Addis Ababa, and the countryside, is still extremely tense. But that is something positive. To the extent that there was some kind of a transactional nature of temporary peace in DRC,
yes.
Mediated or midwifed by Donald Trump, is something good. But we all know, those of us who live in this region, that that peace is not going to last. But just the fact that it exists somehow, it's something that is actually good for us to get from, perhaps to revive the Nairobi process as well as the Rwanda process for a more sustainable peace. So that is a helpful thing. In Kenya, I think the fact that the political handshake, led to some kind of calming of temperatures is something that is healthy. And the reason why it's healthy is because most of the countries in the region look up to Kenya. And so where Kenya goes, it sends a powerful message on where the region should go. Yeah, so that is positive. But also, I'm also, I think, inspired by the fact that despite the turbulence, the economies in the region are growing at a rate of between 5 to 6%.
Like some miracle.
Yeah, and so that is something positive to look up to. Not to mention the increasing, investment despite the turbulence. So that is something positive. However, we still have a dark cloud, hovering over us because we have a lot of unsolved issues that we must confront. And until we confront those issues, we still really, not out of the woods. And so the future prospects are a little bit mixed. But I think the fact that somehow our economies have not stagnated.
So we're leaning more towards the optimistic side of things.
Yes, more optimistic side, just because, the economies are doing better, which means it's likely to absorb a lot more people.
Okay.
Because when people are doing better in their pocket, they tend to do better in other aspects.
What's your one-line message to the AU, Peace and Security Council?
African Union, they need to put their money where the mouth is. And that is something that has been missing. African solutions to African problems is good sloganeering, you see, but it does not exactly actually solve problems. We should go past the time of dependency on waiting for someone else to save us. The more you wait for someone else to save you, the less they respect you, the less they respond to you. It's only by building your agency that goes from beyond rhetoric to reality to practice that we can actually be able to make a difference. And so, Africa, your time is now.
See, that sounds better than that. The other one. What are you saying about the one that goes on a T-shirt? African solutions for African problems. Africa, your time now is actually more of a rallying call and a call to action. Yeah,
indeed.
Yep.
Professor Khannaje, thank you for joining us, having this conversation. Brutal truth is always good.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
The Horn story isn't just about conflict. It's about the economies built around it. Gold, arms, and aid all trade in the same marketplace where peace is the least competitive commodity.
And as we've heard, instability here isn't random. It's managed, monetized, and sometimes even encouraged. The real question is whether peace can ever be made profitable enough to challenge the system.
Because agency begins with the autonomy. When the AU and IGAD stop waiting for outside validation and start investing in their own peace agenda.
And when nations like Somalia prove that digital resilience, local innovation, and domestic revenue can outlast donor fatigue and dependency,
maybe then the Horn's future won't be written by those who fund the wars, but by those who insist on defining their own peace.
That's the challenge and the hope for Africa's most strategic neighborhood.
You've been listening to Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If this episode made you pause, reflect, or reframe, then share it Start a conversation and tag us in. Find us on social media at Panel54Pod. And don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, keep the lens clear.